Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for our fifth seminar of our series Politics of Liberation. Today, we've got the pleasure to have with us Olga Lafazani, an activist and researcher who's going to talk to us about the significance of the insignificant, borders, migration, everyday life. We very much look forward to your talk, Olga, so the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I want to thank Rosa Please, Rosa Vasilaki, Phoebe Daliani, and of course the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and all of you that you are here today. So, as you probably already know, my academic interests evolve around borders, migration, urban space, and everyday life. Still, these topics are not just an academic interest for me, but in my research has always been in this dialectic tension with my militant engagement in anti-racist struggles and struggles for social justice. So in order to open this lecture today, I was thinking to try to position a little bit myself in relation to the field. So as I was thinking how to start this positioning, one incident was coming to my mind again and again. I'm not really sure if it was the most important, but for sure it generated many questions, and it was for me a kind of a starting point. And this was back in 1999, when with a small group of people from Dictio, from Migrant Social Center, we went to Madoudi Evia. It was a camp-like structure for some people who had just arrived in Evia with a boat. It was a period, as you can imagine, that things were really, really different. So it was this incident that we arrived there. It was a fenced space and a warehouse. It was 3 policemen. We just said we are from a solidarity group. They let us in. There were almost 120 people there. And we had with us some oranges, some milk, and also some photocopies of asylum applications. The first thing that was, it forced me in a way to think a lot about action at this point of time, was the fact that while we were distributing the food, it was a really tense moment. The people were arguing a lot about who will get the biggest orange. The cartons of milk, some of them were torn apart by the people on, this conflict of who will get it in the end. So in a way, this incident kind of dismantled, my view, my 20s view, very romanticized of the solidarity from below, and kind of forced me to think about the violence involved in dispossession, and also how there is this very strong antagonism between the oppressed. But at the same time, it made me quite stubborn to fight against inequalities. And the second reason I chose this event back then was the fact that at this point of time, we would actually enter this camp-like structure, and it was enough for the people to sign their names, to write their names and sign a photocopied paper to apply for asylum. So in a way, for me, it has kept my interest, these topics, as it has been a really, really changing field. So within these last 20 years, this field of migration and borders has been much more institutionalized, has been heavily securitized, policed, bureaucratized, and put in this much wider context of EU and national policies. And I think this is one of the reasons that all these years, these topics have kept my interest, that it is this changing field, it is not stable. And at the same time, these changes do not depict only migration movements, but actually depicts geopolitical relations globally. They depict the priorities and social and economic political relations within and beyond nation states. And of course, they also depict the mobility and the strategies of both migrants and social movements. In this sense, for me, to study migration and borders is much more than studying migration and borders. Although this is not at all given in migration and border studies. I think for critical scholars, it is actually an entrance point to study wider relations of power, to study the state and its transformations, to study inequality and exploitation, to study the genealogies of nationalism and racism, but also to study power relations in the smallest scale at the intersections of race, gender, and class, as I will attempt to do today. From this first visit in this camp-like structure some 23 years ago, I have been also involved in different anti-racist struggles, from the protests in the beginning of 2000 for equal rights and papers for all, to the anti-fascist struggle that started around 2008, 9, 10, mainly around Agios Panteleimonas, and it's still a struggle also. And to the organization of no border camps, especially the one in Lesbos in 2010, to the very big hunger strike of 300 migrants that started in the law school, to the solidarity movement in 2015, to the organizing of the City Plaza squad for refugees, and the anti-racist festival in Athens, and in a way still today, I am trying to have a daily presence within social movements. And in parallel, my research questions were fueled by this participation. So I did my master's thesis. My supervisor was Dina Vai, who is here today, about the camps in Evros in around 2006, 2007. And this was a period that no one knew the existence of the camps. It wasn't like it is today. It was like in this gray zone of borders. And later I did my PhD thesis with Kostis Hadjimichalis in the Department of Geography, and it was about the transnational geographies of migration. And I kind of tried to follow the trajectories of people migrating towards Europe. And this research took me to Tehran, to Istanbul, to Athens, to Patras, to study the different border regimes as they are articulated in different places. And I have worked in different research projects around these questions. My most recent research has taken a more historical turn, and together with Eleni Kiramariou, we are kind of trying to untangle the entangled histories of migration, of arrivals and departures within this last century. And the project I will be working on soon is about the political economies of the refugee camps, but I will speak about this on the next time you invite me. So in order to close this kind of small but also methodological introduction, I will make a comment on these two parallel engagements, the research and the militant activism. And for me, it has never been about doing research in social movements. On the contrary, I have never done that, and I'm quite skeptical also about it. But it has been about this dialectic tension. For example, when you're involved in the daily struggles, you see things in a more complex way. You understand the multiple power relations, the difficulties, but also you understand partially resistance, the way people develop different strategies and practices in order to survive. And in a way, this view sneaks into your research, in the questions you pose, in the methodologies you choose, in the ways you frame your arguments. And at the same time, having a theoretical background to be able to distance yourself from the action, to have a reflexivity, to have a critical view, also makes you useful in the movement. So, after this small or longer, I don't know, introduction, I will go to the main theme of today's presentation. And it's not working. So, can you all read the screen, or do you want me to read in parallel? Is it okay? The light? Okay, perfect. So, most of the literature around borders and migration focuses on the borderlines, analyzing how borders operate through legislations, through agreements, policing, infrastructures, technologies. So rather than analyze migration and borders by focusing only on the border zones, this presentation attempts to capture the multiple relations that connect the camp to the city square, the deportation regime to the train carriage, the newspaper headlines to the apartments, to see how borders form and deform subjectivities, bodies, relations and places in the most mundane, the most insignificant moments in the city. The city is Athens between 2009 and 2013, a time that saw the beginnings of the economic crisis in Greece. During those years, migrants were being increasingly illegalized and racialized by dominant policies and media discourses at the same time, compared to the previous decade of the economic growth. In this sense, I'm sorry. I confused the two computers that I have to. So in this sense, this presentation is not only about racism in everyday life, but also attempts to follow the intersections of the color line and the border line, approaching racialization as a process connected to a wider grid of border and migration policies, discourses and practices from the borderlands to the center of the Athenian metropolis. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that, for example, racialization is not a stable process. If we can think the example of people who migrated from the Balkans, from Albania in the 90s, they were really racialized. There was a very strong negative, both social and state perception of the people, a fact that started changing over the years, also due to the changes of the migration policies. So, furthermore, it is well established in the critical literature that borders have a polysemic nature, as they do not hold the same meaning for everyone. Here we see Kato Nezaka that write that a border is not a line, but a space with depth. And this space changes morphologically on the basis of the identity of the one who enters it. So I think it's really given in a way that borders are quite different for a person who holds an EU passport and can travel freely around, and for a person who holds a passport from Afghanistan, let's say, and faces so many barriers and difficulties in order to move. But my interest is to take a step further from this statement. So this paper will discuss not only how meanings, experiences, and spaces change in relation to the identity of the people who cross the borders, but actually how identities, bodies, and spaces are themselves produced through bordering practices. So in other words, I'm interested about the productive character of the border. For example, if we take an Agabenian look, an Agabenian reading of power, we would use concepts as spaces of exception, sovereign power, bare life. Still, such an analysis risks underestimating the multiple and spatially differentiated regimes where where power operates, thus conceiving it in a monolithic sense, as power could be beyond history, beyond space, beyond social relations. Foucault, on the other hand, works on an understanding of power as a relation, as a wider grid of practices and technologies that penetrate social life, while individuals, as Foucault writes, are never the inert or consenting targets of power. They are always its relays. In other words, power passes through individuals. It is not applied to them. In this sense, borders, as technologies of power, do not function only as administrative, bureaucratic, or policing institutions, but fabricate everyday life itself by producing differences, divisions, hierarchies, by locating and dislocating certain bodies in relation to others, by disciplining and subjugating, by manufacturing positions of superiority and subordination, of privilege and dispossession, by crafting places of belonging and not belonging. So, in today's presentation, by using fragments of narrations of everyday encounters, I try to create an episodic film script, turning the spotlight on the different acts and scenes, shedding light on different moments, places, people, and encounters. Brought together, they create a kind of a map of these multiple and complicated ways borders operate as technologies of power within the everyday life. So the focus is on these microbe-like, clandestine, insignificant acts of everyday life, in which borders are renegotiated between the ones who belong and the ones who do not. Belonging is not conceived as a sense, as we usually say, but it's conceived as a socially constructed position that manufactures bodies, acts, feelings. In encounters, such as the one de Bois described above in the first quote we saw, in which the border is performed in the different ways of recognizing and approaching the stranger, in the gazes, in the feelings, in the question posed, and the ones that cannot be framed, in the answers given, and the ones left hanging. Moreover, just to give some very few ideas of a more theoretical, let's say, context, as you already understood, I work on everyday life, a concept taken by Henry Lefebvre. Lefebvre sees in everyday life both the conflicts, the difficulties, the repetition, but also the possibility of emancipation. So everyday life becomes a field much more significant than it seems, than it is presented. And I will come back to that later. Also, I'm taking some theoretical insights from post-colonial writing, from feminist, from critical geography. I will emphasize on 2 points. The one has to do with stranger fetishism, and Sarah Ahmed was writing about stranger fetishism that as the process of fetishization, I'm not sure, involves not only the displacement of social relations onto an object, but the transformation of fantasies into figures. And I think this process of displacement is quite common in both academic and political discourses. So by displacing social relations and fantasies onto the figure of the migrant, the latter is portrayed as dangerous, threatening, as illegal, or as a vulnerable and a victim. Also, within academic discourses, instead of analyzing social relations themselves, these are displaced into the subjects. In this way, migrants become bare lives, become invisible, become voiceless. Or, on the contrary, they might become nomadic subjects, hybrid subjects, or probably revolutionary subjects. So, moving beyond these predetermined figures of a migrant and a local, I try to approach subjectification as an ongoing process, as a conflicting process, complicated and open within the everyday life. As Butler suggests, one should not presuppose a doer behind a deed, but to think of the ways the doer is variably constructed in and through the deed. So instead of presupposing an identity, a migrant identity, a voiceless or, I don't know, a nomadic subject, in this work I try to understand how the subjects are produced within the encounters, the deeds in their everyday lives. Last but not least, I approach the negotiation of borders through everyday encounters in the urban space. Sarah Ahmed is writing about encounters, and she's writing that each encounter is not only happening in the present, but reopens past encounters. And each encounter is carrying traces of wider relations of power and antagonism, as the bodies that meet have already been formed and deformed by the norms and relations of gender, race, and class within multiple and interlocking geographical scales. Nonetheless, and this is what I find also very challenging for today, encounters are meetings and as such involve surprise and conflict. So the way Ahmed conceptualizes encounter is essential, as it can really capture time and space in the different forms. Starting from here and now, the particular encounter, and thinking about how it is played out, including the past as memory, history, as other spaces, as previous experiences, and structured power relations, but also opening the possibility of surprise, or in other words, the possibility of another future and another space than the one that already seems predetermined. So I will stop here with the theory, blah, blah, and we will get to the more ethnographic part of the paper. And still, I will be giving you like 1 minute to read the stories. All these stories come from ethnographic research. They're abstracts of interviews with migrants in Athens. Here, Mubarak, a 28-year-old man from Afghanistan, narrates his encounter with a middle-aged Greek man in a train in Athens. As you see, as Sarah Ahmed was writing, encounters are meetings which are not simply in the present, as each encounter reopens past encounters. In this way, in the quote you see here, Mubarak seems to know from other previous accidental encounters that he is not yet recognized as a stranger. The first question is always the same. Where are you from? a question that points out that he is not from here, that he does not really belong here, a question that delineates the stranger, that keeps him in his place. And then a series of other questions, questions that would not be asked in other accidental encounters, as Mubarak seems to know well. Questions that mark the difference, that shape the figure of the one who is considered to be out of place. Discussing this story in a university class with some students, some kept repeating that the local man who is asking the questions is just the weird person in the bus, and that Mubarak is taking it personally. It is true that even for anthropology students who are taught to think along the lines of race, gender, and class, whiteness and masculinity still seem to go unnoticed. So I kept asking them, who can it be? Who can it be, this weird person in the train? Can it be a 20-year-old girl? Can it be a man of color? Can it be a gay person? So the body of the weird person on the train has certain characteristics in terms of gender, age, race, and nationality. The one who is asking the questions has embodied the power to do so, has embodied the institutional and social demarcations, the dominant discourses and policies, the bordering practices. So as a white, older man, he exercised the power to designate and to produce the other bodies within encounters in everyday life. The weird person not only feels that he belongs there, but that he owns the place, that he can challenge others, but he cannot be challenged himself. Borders in the everyday life are embodied and performed, but at the same time they are also challenged. In this accidental encounter on the train in Athens, the Greek man seems to embody the power to demarcate spaces and bodies. His work, his words, his look, and his touch designate the stranger. On the other hand, Mubarak says, many times I have got down from the train, and his words seem to condense the feeling of subordination, the embodiment of his inferior position. As mentioned earlier, though, encounters are meetings which do not simply take place in the present. A new encounter reopens past encounters, but it's not fully predetermined. Every encounter may involve an element of surprise. As Lefebvre was writing, everyday life is not only about continuous adaptations, but also about conflicts relating to processes of collective and individual consciousness. In this encounter, Mubarak decided he has to stay and deal with the problem, acknowledging in a way the fact that he is considered to be the problem in the Boas world. He decided he cannot always get off the train, so he looked the Greek man in the eyes, he spoke out loud, and he challenged his inferior position, defying the given border not only through words, but also with his body. Act 2. Nur, the person that we see the quote from, has lived in Athens for 10 years. When we did the discussion, he was 33 years old. He was working in the construction sector. So if for the white male, the stranger constitutes an intruder who has to either be disciplined or kicked away, then for the white female, the stranger in the public space is both a danger and a threat. Women are taught to feel vulnerable and afraid by gender norms, by mainstream discourses, by institutional policies, but also by social practices and by the collective or individual experiences of violence in their daily lives. Women are taught to be streetwise, not to talk alone, not to walk alone in the public space. And if they do so, to watch out, to be careful, to keep their distance. A differentiated geography of mobility and boundaries in the urban space is delineated in terms of gender, as feminist critical geographies have outlined. The socially constructed diptych depicts the public space as dangerous and the home as safe. Nonetheless, the fear of the stranger in the street serves also to conceal the fact that the home can be an unsafe space for many women too, as well as the fact that most sexual attacks are committed by friends and family in the home. Noor, on the other hand, says that as he doesn't want to frighten the women, he also keeps his distance. From his narrative, it seems that he has accepted that he is the problem, that he has accepted and partially embodied the gaze of those that see him as dangerous, criminal, and illegal. Moreover, the embodiment of this inferiority is evident also in Noor's arguments, as he justifies the hostile or even aggressive attitude of Greeks who arrived because there are too many strangers. The hegemony of nationalism becomes apparent in the way Noor talks. The division between migrants and locals and the superiority of the latter, at least in terms of rights in their own territory, is presented as being so natural, so inevitable, so common sense, that even the victims of such ideological schemas seem to identify with it. This subordination, as I was telling in the beginning, has been embodied in multiple ways and in several different places. Through the violence and the humiliations in the EU borders, through imprisonment in detention centers all over the country, through sweep operations, through overexploitation in working sites, through the newspaper headlines and the TV reports, through the looks, the words, and the actions of the people he accidentally encounters in the urban space. Rahim is a 31-year-old man from Afghanistan, and he's describing an accidental encounter with a woman that took place one evening in the street in the port city of Patras. The embodiment of subordination is not a linear process that always comes to the same end. Or, in other words, every encounter involves surprise. In contrast to the earlier story that saw Noor accept his positioning as the problem and keeping his distance, Rahim is trying with his attitude and his body to question the gazes, words, and deeds that classify him as the problem. In this story, borders are challenged through the clandestine forms taken by the dispersed, tactical, and makeshift creativity of groups or individuals already caught in the nets of discipline, as Desertot was writing. Rahim acts spontaneously, imitating the woman who is pushing herself against the wall, mimicking her attitude, questioning who is in fact is the dangerous one in this particular encounter. Moreover, the discourse used by Rahim to describe the way some Greek people regard him is completely different than Noor. Not only does he not justify them, but he explicitly states that he is very frustrated by the case of the people who, by recognizing him as a stranger, regard him as something bad. Several of the migrants who participated in the research felt the need to emphasize that they are human. In a social, economic, and political context that treats and describes migrants as illegals, as dangerous, as criminals, increasingly seeing them as a homogenized group, the need to emphasize being human seem to be really, really important. And in a way, it seems as a practice to subvert this subordination. In a way, this declaration of humanity, of being human in self, can be read as an attempt to rephrase and to transgress this subordinate position. It's like a refusal of being a bare life, as a struggle against these processes of dehumanization. Rahim also reverses the hegemonic bordering practices through his words, deed, and his body. He uses his body to mimic the attitude of the woman who is frightened of him, trying to reverse the notion that he is an object of fear. Respectively, in his discourse, he is reversing the attitudes that face and treat migrants as non-human by stating that those who have such an attitude are not humans. Act 3. Uranus is a 31-year-old woman from Afghanistan, was a 30, now I think she's older. And she's describing her daily encounters with her neighbors who live in the same block of flats in Patissia, a downgraded neighborhood in the center of Athens. Uranus has lived in this apartment for over 2 years, together with her husband and their 3 children. All these small remarks constantly remark spaces and senses of belonging and not belonging. Remarks that proliferate in the most common, in the most mundane activities. The noise in children, the closing of the elevator door, the fall of a garment. Hannah Arendt was writing in 1943, "Once we could buy our food and ride in the subway without being told we are undesirable. We have become a little hysterical since newspapermen started detecting us and telling us publicly to stop being disagreeable when shopping for milk and bread. We wonder how it can be done." Arendt's description highlights in a way how the most trivial, the most everyday activities can become trigger points of negative criticism. But I think that actually the underlying question is whether it is the acts per se that are the trigger points or the presence of a subject who is constructed already as unwanted and a stranger. All these small remarks follow the same trajectory, the same direction, from the local, the one who is and feels entitled to a certain national space, towards the stranger, the migrant, the one who has always to be reminded that he does not really belong. If the situation was reversed, if Uranus, for example, was going to her neighbor and was telling her, your children are very noisy, the answer would probably have been, as it has been so many times in the past, if you don't like it, go back to your country. So the national border and its crossing, in a subtle or in a crude way, is always present in these encounters. The legality or illegality of the crossing makes actually no difference, as the mere presence of migrants in the city is being increasingly legalized. After all, the purpose of these remarks is not actually to regulate or organize coexistence, but to reaffirm a certain power relation that demarcates spaces of belonging from the borderlands to the housing tenements. And the last act, as I won't be speaking all night. This is a passage from my research diary, so it's not a part of an interview. So, Leila was a 24-year-old woman from Syria, and Maria was a 56-year-old woman from Greece. So, the friendship of these two women seems to subvert different boundaries and borders that are often produced and reproduced as non-traversable, such as nationality, religion, social and cultural backgrounds. Moreover, their friendship also challenges other boundaries construed through age and language differences. What brings these two women so close? How did they communicate? After I spent some time with them during my research, it became clear that it was their gender and class experiences that brought them together. Bringing up children, the loneliness of being at home and not participating in the labor market, while at the same time sharing their also gendered daily chores and routines like cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, ironing, going to the supermarket, taking the children to the park. The relation between the twin women indicates that language is one code of communication and experience amongst many others, such as movements, signs, as well as the sharing of feelings or experiences like motherhood, loneliness, or everyday routine. If this paper is about the ways borders work in the everyday life through bodies, gazes, gestures, and signs, the relation of the two women indicates how borders are traversed and subverted through bodies, gazes, gestures, and signs. Their encounter captures the exceptional within the ordinary, as the title of the act indicates. No. So, in order to come to a close, I will have some final remark. So the different acts and scenes shed light on these less visible, less tangible, non-regulated border practices. Practices that nonetheless can be really persistent, and borders that can be really hard to cross. Through the acts and scenes in this paper, I tried to create this film script made up of these dynastic stories taking place in different spaces involving different protagonists. The script focused on the multiple and complicated ways borders as technologies of power incite and induce possible ways of action. When migrants bend their head, lower their gaze, cross the street in order not to frighten the passerbys, when they get off the train, when they accept the remarks without answering, when they say there is no more room for migrants in Greece. The same script shows how locals embody and perform the border, when they feel entitled to demarcate the public urban spaces, to ask the questions, to frame the remarks, to undermine, to patronize. Starting from the everyday life, one can also think about the multiple ways borders are traversed, contested, and subverted by, by both migrants and locals. So, in the different acts and scenes, one can come across all these moments when migrants did not back down but replied. They claimed belonging and the right to public spaces. They challenged with their bodies and words their subordination. But also to all these moments that locals questioned their own privilege, ignored the multiple borderings and demarcations, and built relations of mutual care and reciprocity. So if the identities of the subjects are not stable and fixed, but continuously under construction through practices and encounters, so are the identities of the different places. Thinking of the ways borders are negotiated in everyday life sheds light on many different aspects of cities, not only those of fear, exclusion, or ghettos, but also the cities of coexistence, spontaneity, care, and emancipation. Cities that are ambivalent, are never closed or completed, but are a simultaneity of stories so far. So the suggestion okay, whatever. The suggestion for future research that arise from this paper is simple. In order to understand how borders work, we have to not only analyze the border zones or conceive them through policies, dominant discourses, and institutions, we should also try to shed light on the significance of the insignificant, on the practices of the everyday life, on the multiple and conflicting border negotiations that manufacture subjectivities and spaces, from the camp to the train carriage, from the border zones to the city squares, from the body to the globe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga, for your talk and for giving us this insight in the reproduction of borders in everyday life. Have we got any questions? I mean, we do, but we'll be last to ask questions. Are there any questions from you or thoughts you would like to share with us?
I left everyone speechless, huh?
Can we have the microphone, please? It's for the recording.
So, hello. During your examples, you didn't mention what happens with the people that they know that they're here in Greece because they're trapped. How does that affect the psychology, both the people who come to Greece and both the residents of Greece? Did you have such examples of people that they feel that they are trapped here as the first stop to enter Greece, to enter Europe?
I should answer. The research material I presented was kind of taken before the summer of migration, or the refugee crisis, as it's more commonly said. And in a way, being trapped, it's I don't know, being trapped or being in transit, or, there is a very wide discussion within literature, and also on how these policies are constructed. But because actually my opinion is that being trapped means it's actually connected to labor market in Greece. So the real problem that has arisen is how the economic crisis and the refugee crisis are intertwined. The reason that people need to leave from Greece is that they cannot survive here. They cannot find a decent work. So I think this entrapment is actually a result of both economic policies and also migration policies. So I think it's this, double connection. And I don't know how to answer about the psychology actually of people, because I think different people find really different ways to cope with this. And I could try to avoid, a very generalized answer that people feel like that because they are trapped. Also, for example, there is this discussion, the trauma of the refugees, but why we should presuppose that every refugee has a trauma. And it's like psychologizing people. And I think for me it's more interesting to keep this open field of different practices and strategies of people. And of course, I don't mean that they're not people who are totally beaten by the border. They have to stand down. They're feeling very bad, very, very subordinated. But I think I wouldn't like to, to presuppose it.
Kostis, Sibella, can you pass the micro behind? Oh, it's over there. Okay.
Thank you, Olga. I think this was fascinating, and I have to say right from the start that I really like this approach that escapes the victimization of the refugee that is so common, sometimes, with the best intentions among solidarity movements, and this idea that the refugee is the eternal victim. I guess my only question, this is because I'm a historian, since you describe this as a very dynamic process, and it's like a battlefield where the borders are negotiated on every instance, what happens with time? Would you incorporate this question of how this protagonist of this film, if you were to meet them again, or what is the actual historical circumstance? To what extent is it is important for this renegotiation of borders? Because this is in 2010, 2012. Could one, for instance, push back by saying that at the same time time heals the dimension of exclusion, or focusing on different community would give you an idea of inclusion that challenges this? How do you incorporate time in your analysis? This is I guess my question.
I don't know, I think in the way I conceive border regimes, they are also a dynamic process within time. So, and the last period, I'm really interested in the changes that this field have undergone. For example, I was thinking about the camp, and I started with this example of this camp-like structure, and how has the idea or the application of the camp changed within the last 30 years in Greece. Like from the camps that were created in the Greco-Albanian border in the 90s, these very unofficial structures during the 2000s in all the Aegean islands that were between warehouses and fenced spaces, and then how during 2009 and in relation to the economic crisis that was coming, with migrants being so much scapegoated, camps become a pre-election promise. The government in the elections of 2012, from the grey zones that no one knew there were camps for refugees in Greece, they become a promise that we will build more camps and we will fence the borders. The fence in Evros was built back then. New camps they were promising that new camps will open. And then it's this period that for me, it's very indicative how the detention time changes within just a few years. From 3 months maximum before 2010, it becomes 9 months, 12 months, 24 months, 36, and according to Dendias, at around 2012 or 13, he's announcing indefinite detention for people who, if we think about detention, it's not a personal sentence, it's not someone who has committed a crime. It is just that someone has crossed the borders without papers. So maximum of felony, but and how the local policies change in relation to migration movement in different periods of time, and how then with the refugee crisis, again, there were camps also in the urban space or closer to the urban space, the policies of Syriza within the first 6 months, how they also changed that, how today, for example, they are closing. So I try to say an example about camps to try to see the last 30 years and the changes this field is undergoing. And I would like to find, but I'm not sure if I could find, because time has also much other. I'm trying to find one of the maps I had created. Yeah, I found it. Amazing. I didn't expect it. And it. Can I take the projector here? I can try. In this laptop. On Unity. I'm sorry for the delay. Αν δουλέψει, if it works. Ah. No. So here you can see the map. You cannot see anything. Nice. I can see the map. Okay. The idea of this map, yes, I can show it to you. No. Ah. I wanted to impress you, that's why I was waiting. So it is this map that shows the movement of one of the people, Rahim, that I presented a small part of his interview before, has traveled in order to arrive from Tehran to Munich. So I wanted to show this map because it has to do also with time and entrapment, and also attempts to avoid it or to practices to subvert it. So we see that he started his journey in 2008. He arrives in Lesbos Island here, then he's returned back to Turkey. He arrives in Lesbos again. Then he lives in Lesbos. He attempts to go to Athens, to Patras, and then back again and back again. And he's doing this round between Lesbos and Patras for 3 years. And then at some point of time, he manages to leave through the Balkan route, actually, or one way of the Balkan route. And he arrives in Munich. He's married with a girl from Germany now, and he lives there. So this is also time, and how time, you know, it is what we were saying before also, that borders have this polysemic character. For example, for me to go to Munich is a booking from my computer, and recently I also traveled to Germany and no one checked my passport. No one. Because my passport was my body. I'm a white female, nice, I look European. No one needed to see the actual passport. But for him, at the same time, he had to spend 4 years back and forth. He had to spend a lot of money to work in the in-between in order to materialize the same trip. So time is also constantly present within these trajectories of migration.
Can we have the microphone over there, please?
Yes. Good evening. Thank you very much for your presentation. I had a small question which was based mostly on the last act, the one on the two ladies who managed to befriend and interact without sharing the same language. I was wondering whether during your research you had instances or examples of situations where the non-regulated borders of belonging and unbelonging are temporarily reprocessed or displaced. Like, for instance, you mentioned some examples where people who have migratory background do live for a certain time in a city, for instance. So I wonder whether after some time they can be seen as residents at a very local space, in the sense that, for instance, in terms of daily encounters, they will share a same bus, and for instance, they will share the challenge of having the same crowded bus or the same missing bus, or for instance, of sharing the same building or the same street and feeding a dog, feeding cats, and somehow the gaze slightly changing towards persons with whom we share the same interest, the same space.
Of course, I think borders are transversed within the city, but they're also reminded. I don't think that someone who lives even for 20 years still he or she might be again and again reminded of the fact that she is not from here. For example, I remember the other day, I was in the emergency room in a hospital, waiting in the hospital. So there were a lot of people, there was a lot of delay, everyone was complaining about the delay. Everyone was saying, and the doctors and the system and So there was this, crowd of complaining. There was a woman that seemed to be like from Russia, for example. And her accent was perfect. She seemed very, to be to be living many years here, when she said, this is not acceptable, what is this situation with the system of health? Two people turned and told her, if you don't like it, go back to your country. So the same situation, the same problem, the same complaint, the same waiting time, the same room, and still she had to be reminded that she's not from here. And of course, this is not happening always. And of course, there are very close relations, of course, there are friendships, of course, there is a lot of affection, of care, of support, of solidarity. I don't want to say that it's, there is one thing or one picture. But I think somehow what is becoming more obvious from time to time has to do with the wider social, economic, and political situation, with the political climate. For example, the same people who before, I remember a story that was shared with me from a friend. He was coming from Afghanistan. He was living in Athens for many, many years. And he was telling me that I go to the owners of my house, that, he was renting a house in the first floor, for example, the people were living in the fourth floor. So he was saying that I go to see them, and whenever I go to give the rent, they ask me to stay more, to have coffee, to eat with them. It's an old couple, they're very lonely, and this was happening for many years. And then around this period of scapegoating, migrants, headlines of, you would always see the reportages in the television, the dangerous Athens and the maps of this very frightening city, that the image would show you just two people walking in the street, and it would say crime scene in the Victoria Square, for example, or whatever. And he started telling that slowly they started avoiding him. Although it was the same people. They were inviting him every time in their house, and slowly they started racializing him, portraying according to the dominant discourse. So I'm interested about how this interrelation of dominant discourses, of structural relations, is depicted in everyday life. And I think it's both. It's not...
Is there a question? Maybe I can ask a question while we're... No, go ahead. Please, can we have the microphone over there? We need it for the recording.
Okay. Yeah. So thanks for the presentation. Actually, I want to do like a crossover question with what Kostis also said before. So I have a question about what comes first, in your opinion, dehumanization or victimization? So, for example, one path would be I dehumanize migrants and refugees, so I start from a distance, and then the only way that I can reach them, even in good conscience, is by portraying them as victims, which means that they have already lost the way they work, the way where they live, their culture. Like, even that kind of sounds like colonial, to approach them only by culture. It's weird. So in that case, this comes first. In another portrayal, like starting from migrants and migrant bodies in the source of Greek islands, starts from victimization, and then it might build up the distance, so that builds the dehumanization. So I have like two paths, two different things happening, and I'm not sure which one produces the other, if they have a connection or if they have a contradiction. You might even say that they're the same thing, but I don't know where to start, Thanks.
what I would say is that if we take the recent events like after 2015, for example, the first approach was this one of solidarity, or probably it would be, I think, this kind of victimization of the helpless people arriving in the European shores, and that Europe would try to take care of them. So I think, for example, for this 1 year or even less than 1 year, it was this vulnerability and victimization of the people that were arriving in the European shores. And I think, just to make a parenthesis, this had nothing to do with what was happening in the Greek islands, for example, at that point of time. So it wasn't about, like, the people who were arriving they seemed really powerful, really motivated. They seemed to have achieved something really important for their lives, like a step in their lives. So this portraying of the victims of war that actually also was transformed by social movements into a solidarity movement also. So it was a more complicated time. But what I want to say, I think that what followed was the dehumanization. So the next years, after the signing of the EU agreement, it started being all the more again the threat in the borders, nationalism as it is played now between Greece and Turkey, that has a very that has a basis on the migration issue. So what I would again say is that it kind of depends. There is not a stable trajectory that always comes like that. For example, people from Albania arriving in the 90s were totally racialized. There was a lot of discrimination against them, and still within the years, they managed to rebuild their lives in Greece, mainly due to the labor market. Like in the 90s, in the beginning of 2000s, you remember it was like this powerful Greece, the joining of the Eurozone that was synonymous of a development and progress and prosperity, the 2004 Olympic Games. So who built this prosperity and all these national pride of this period? And so in a way, in this period, people were dehumanized, but still the social and economic and political situation within the country and their labor also managed to create a different. So I think we have to examine border regimes in time in a way to see how they are differentiating, not to try to find one stable way to say it is like that or it is not like that. We have to try to see it as an open process, as a process that it's always related, because this is very common. Like, you see like migration studies scholars who might try to explain migration only in relation to migration, which is really weird. Or, they also pose these very interesting questions. How many migrants are? I don't know. Why should the social scientists care? This is a question posed by the state, not the social scientists. Why should we care to count people? I mean, okay, to have an idea in general, but that's it. Or how many are illegal? Who cares also? it's state questions. So how the state questions come to be questions of social research, and how in this field of migration, these two, let's say, apparatuses, the state and academic and research, they come really close sometimes in a very weird way. So in critical migration, we do not discuss migration, as a thing that is happening in a stable way, or that it's only connected to the war in Afghanistan, for example, or whatever. We understand migration as a parameter of the state of social life, of political, social, economic relations. We try to understand migration in relation to this field, to this, to state, to beyond state, to transnational movements. So, I cannot see it as a closed process. I think it is always interrelated with the wider context.
Anyone else? Well, while you're thinking, I will ask a question to Olga. I was wondering, because you described very well, and I never thought of everyday life and all these kinds of larger or smaller microaggressions as being a border. And it's a very interesting thought of the ways you're constantly reminded of that kind of like lack of belonging. But I was wondering, how do we actually challenge those invisible or silent borders in everyday life? I mean, we can challenge practically. I mean, on the level of activism or on the level of politics, we can challenge, as you said, state policies, open the borders, or asylum seekers, or specific ways we engage with all that. How do we engage? How do we actually challenge? How do we change those invisible borders of the everyday life?
I don't know, I think they are really persistent. I think these more invisible borders, they are really, really, really grounded. And you also see it also with people that are very involved in social movements, for example. They are very close to the anti-Ra movement. And still you see these colonial ideas, sneaking inside, even if you don't want it. Or, these predetermined categories. And for me, I think it has to do with not predetermining the people that you meet. Not trying to create these stable, stereotyped, sometimes categories of, I don't know, sometimes people ask me, do you see different behaviors between, I don't know, people coming from Afghanistan and people coming from Pakistan? And this is also a very quite common theme of research in migration studies that I find extraordinarily interesting. But, and then, obviously there are national histories, there are ways of struggle. There are, bonds. There are hegemonic ideologies in different parts. At the same time, I think, I don't know, to be open, to be surprised, to be open, not to face the stranger that you have already predetermined how he or she will be. I don't know if I answered, or if I... And also to be aggressive to other people who do it. For example, I was in my elevator in my block of flats the other day, and there is this woman, and we go into the elevator together, and she tells me, like, she's my neighbor, I know her. And she says, in Kypseli, it's full of black people nowadays. I was like, what? Like, this common sense that, like she was talking about the weather. Like, you know, it's totally normal that since I am white, I will agree that black people are a problem. So it was very aggressive to her, as you can imagine. So this is also a way to deal with it.
So I have also a question. I would like a bit from your experience as an activist to tell us a bit more about, you know, in terms of organizing, in terms of everyday life resistance, how it's possible, I mean, from people from a different, I mean, cultural, political, economic background, I mean, to coordinate, to do something, to be effective. I mean, because sometimes, I mean, presupposes a lot of knowledge or a way, you know, to go through in everyday stuff that. So, I mean, from your experience, what do you think that this can happen?
You know, probably I can say some things about like most recent experience around City Plaza, for example. And, you know, in City Plaza, it was a squatted building. There were something like 350, 400 people living there from at least 10 different countries. And okay, it's quite complicated. It wasn't easy, as you can understand. Self-organization takes a lot of organization. It doesn't just, you know, blares in spring. It means that, you know, we have to try a lot, we have to organize a lot, to be very committed, to have a lot of presence. But still, I think, and I will, for example, if someone was to come into City Plaza, we would make an introduction to the people who were coming. And the introduction would say, you know, this is not an NGO space or a space from the States, it's a self-organized space, and it does not belong to us, it is occupied, and here we try to respect all the people, no matter of their gender, race, class, And, you know, this was the introduction that we tried in the most simple terms to translate the discussion within the European movement into the most simple terms, but still it wasn't only about talking about it, because people would come with very, very different political and social experiences of struggle. So for us was like an occupied building, for example, or anti-sexism or anti-racism, it wasn't just about explaining it. It was probably that it meant something very different. It was something totally uncommon. So in a way, the answer for me was, again, everyday life. And I don't say it in an easy way, because I think what happened in City Plaza, for example, was that this common everyday life was actually what brought people closer. For example, if they would think that, I don't know, Jamile was the manager, then they would say, they would see her carry the dirty blankets, going up and down the stairs, cleaning, queuing for food. So, for example, it destabilized everyday life, this kind of hierarchy that people thought it was kind of given. Or, for example, the fact that the space was occupied, there was this very funny, in a way, incident that we were kind of expecting a fascist attack, or not expecting it, but being afraid of it. So we were preparing. So we would say, you will go in this balcony, you will do that, we will have shifts everywhere, we will have, like, I don't know, hoses outside in the balconies. So, you know, we were like in this very strategic and hype mood. And there was one person who was living for like a few months in City Plaza and said, okay, why should we do all this? Why don't we just call the police? We were like, what do you mean? But, you know, there is a lack of understanding sometimes, but still, the fact that people saw us doing all this, it was also the way to understand that, you know, this is an occupied space. You know, you cannot call the police to protect you. You know, so, and I'm giving a very small example, but I really think the ways we spoke to each other, the ways we cooked together, we cleaned the building. So this level of everyday reproduction, that it's usually never a political slogan except of some feminist groups, but still it's kind of hidden. It's in the house, it's, you know, it's not the realm of politics. These things became very, very political, became the center of our common life, and also became a way of organizing. And I think it's a key also not to, I don't know, not to have, I mean, somehow, you know, I don't know how to say it, not to sound very weird, but what I want to say in a way is that, you know, obviously there were different needs, and there are different needs in the street, in the squats. There are different priorities, different ways. Also among people who are in the antagonistic social movement in Athens, not only, I mean, but even more. For example, City Plaza, if for the people involved in the solidarity group was like, you know, a space of struggle and against borders and against inequalities and against capitalism, whatever. For the people who were coming to stay, it was their need to have a safe room, not to be homeless or not to live in the camps. So it was many times you start, and this is the same, for example, in a demonstration. My imagination of organizing a demonstration is to smash borders. And then people want to go to Germany to live a more safe life and to find work. So, you know, and in a way, I think you work in these differences. You have to find ways to build on them and not to be very, very closed into your own priorities and to leave the space of openness. For example, the other day we were talking about, I was telling you this incident that there was in a room, a couple, the man was beating his wife within City Plaza. The neighbors came to the solidarity group. They told us, you know, this woman is getting beat every night. We can hear her. We were furious immediately. We went to this man. We told him, you know, there is this problem, and you know, there is this rule of non-violence within City Plaza. So you broke this rule. You have to go. Your wife and your child can stay as long as they need to, but you cannot stay here any longer. So okay, we thought that we gave a good solution to the situation, and then for weeks, his wife was coming to see us, to talk to us. She was crying every time. She was telling her, you know, I cannot survive, and At some point of time, she came, and it was me and a couple of other people, and she tells, you know, I don't know what are your priorities and how your life is. But, you know, I am 20 years old. I have a 6-month child. I don't speak the language. I cannot work. So I need my husband to survive. So then we brought him back. I mean, we had a very difficult discussion with him. We tried to persuade him to that it was the last time, you can never do that again. It's not easy. I mean, like, you know, it's still a process, and it's an everyday life. As far as we heard, he never did it again. As far as we heard. Who knows? I gave you a very precise answer. You see.
Are there any more questions? Yes, please. Can we have the mic, please?
Well, since you start from everyday life and caution every one of us not to see migrants or the whole number of stories as something that is homogenized or the same all over the place, don't you think perhaps locals shouldn't be seen in the same homogenizing way? And second, everyday life is characterized by the presence of migrants for many decades now. Do we have an indication that the locals are also changing, adapting to the new situation or whatever? I'm thinking of younger people who do not have any experience of Athens not being a mixed city. I mean, it's already 30 years. It's not a couple of years. People are born in a city that was, during their lifetime, always mixed. They cannot be the same as, you know, us older people who had different experience. So does this enter into your way of dealing with everyday life in the city?
For the first point, I totally agree. I also think that, you know, creating this scheme of migrants and local, it serves as an analytical way, you know, it serves as a methodological way, but not an analytical way. So as a methodology, you know, you follow this borderline and you try to understand how this borderline of race and nationality affects these everyday relations. At the same time, obviously, I think there is not a homogenized group of locals who do that. And I think it has the same tensions, like what you said, for example, probably the next generation, the generation that, and I think it actually has to do with also the structural conditions, but also the experiences of everyday life. So I totally agree with what you say, that there is a next generation that is more used to that. At the same time, also in this generation, there are groups of Golden Dawn. So I mean, it's not just the coexistence that will automatically, or you know, in a smooth way, in a linear way, change things. But for sure, I agree that, you know, younger people, they do not see migration as something so unnatural as it was presented, for example, in the 90s. In the 90s, there was this huge myth that Greece was turned from a country of this, how do we say, of sending migrants to receiving. Yes, and it was a very interesting myth of the, you know, discussion at that point of time, because, you know, yes, of course, if you would just take 5 years from then, yes, but you know, you cannot see this. Migration has formed the societies, has formed the cities. It's a very short view to say that suddenly it was transformed. Of course, there were migrants arriving before and leaving, and now it's again the same. For example, now there is this whole discussion about how many migrants can be in Greece, and that there is not enough room for everyone, and And the net migration rate in Greece, it's negative for the last 12 years, I think 2010 or 2009. Every year, the net migration in Greece is negative. Even the year of the refugee arrival of 2015, it was still negative. Within these years, there are 450,000 people who have migrated only to Germany. So at the same time that there is a huge migration from the country, still the dominant discourses present that there is not enough room for more migrants. So, I mean, I think there is a change, and the presence of migrants within these years is important, but I still think that it is not a stable, field. It is not something given.
That was very interesting, the fact that if you're white, and especially white European, you're never perceived, or maybe you don't even think of yourself as being a migrant, but something else, as a student, as a young professional. I mean, we've heard the discourse of mobility. When Europeans move across the world, is mobility. When people outside Europe move across the world, is migration. And I was wondering, how and when was that narrative changed, from, let's say, the overarching framework of victimization, the ones you mentioned. We had the same with Ukrainian migrants recently. They're the victims, we need to embrace them, and so on and so forth. What was that movement, that shift, if we can identify it, when the narrative shifted from victimization to danger, threat, cultural threat as well? It's not just, I think, a major shift that happened, at least that's my impression, in relation to this kind of essentially far-right discourse in recent years, is that the migrant is not simply a criminal. It's not simply someone who steals jobs, but above all, is someone who threatens the nation culturally. That kind of if we couldn't, I don't know if it's possible to identify, but one question that I had during this discussion is, when did the migrant become the main threat for the nation's existence? When did cultural anxiety became the dominant narrative, as it were?
When communism stopped. I mean, I think that this shift is that, in a way, when there was this communist threat until 80s or 90s, it was a way to construct this inner and outer enemy. Is this correct? Yes. Based on the Cold War. And I think when this stopped, there had to be another kind of, danger for European society, to having an undeclared war for a long period of time. It's, it's something that it's useful both for hegemony and for the economy of the war industries. So in a way, I think that this shift was kind of I don't know, replacing the threat, and you know, I could talk a lot about it, but I don't think it's, or I don't know.
It's open. Okay. Thanks for the fantastic presentation. I would like to comment maybe on the last question, because I'm not sure if we can say that historically racialization is connected with post-communist time, because it's in the core of capitalism, like since the beginning of the legacy of colonialism actually says that we racialize the people also between the different labor conditions and so on, and some people are already racialized in order to fit in the labor hierarchies. So the migrant situation, maybe for the European context, yes, probably I would agree that there is a shift, like with right-wing progress and so on, that like the racialization is goes very back to the, let's say, to the notion of the European identity, to the notion of the nation state, democratic state, and all these problems.
Can I add something? Of course. Can we have the microphone? Thank you. Over there to Philippa.
Just what you said about the end of communism and the relation with cultural anxiety. Actually, this is the thesis of Samuel Huntington, who is a very conservative American scholar. So, the clash of civilizations, you know, his book, very, very famous book in the 90s. So he's a conservative guy. He's a conservative thinker. So maybe.
No, I mean, what I was trying to say, of course, racialization does not coincide with the end of communism. It has nothing to do. What I think, however, is that exactly this construction of the class of civilizations, of terrorism, so this construction that makes migrants a threat, an inner and outer enemy, a threat in the border. So it's not only about racialization. It's this threat to national homogeneity, to, you know, to prosperity. This is the shift, I think, has to do with the end of communism. And this is exactly the story told after in the 90s. We were supposed to be in this borderless world, for whom? So, you know. And at the same time, we had this class of civilizations, exactly this kind of theories that created this illegalization and this transformation of migration into a threat. So it was a period like that in Europe there was no other threat that could be used, that could be, you know, instrumentalized, I remember the word, for both socio-political, economic, you know, reasons. So what was instrumentalized at that point of time was migration. And the Muslim threat also. For example, the word illegal migrant started being a thing right in the end of at around 7. I started saying and then I don't remember. In the oil crisis that's in the 70s, somehow in the end of the 70s. Yes. Yes. So it was this period, after a couple of years, that illegal migrants started to be a term. It did not exist before. So I think this illegalization of migration goes hand in hand with neoliberalism in this period of neoliberalism.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Well, if there no other questions, we would like again to thank Olga for this really interesting presentation, to thank all of you for joining us today. Please join us again. In 2 weeks' time, the seminar series runs pretty much every 2 Fridays of the month. The program is available on our website, politicsofliberation.gr. You can also find us on social media. And in 2 weeks' time from now, on the 25th of November, we'll have trans woman activist, filmmaker, photographer, and poetess Paola Revegnotti joining us for a screening of her latest documentary, Oleanders, and followed up by a discussion. We would be delighted to see you again here. Thank you.